Good afternoon and welcome to the Week 12 lecture. So this week we are going to take a look at a topic that we'll be covering for the discussion next week on week 13. You're going to be talking about the night watchman approach, which has a lot to do with economics and economic regulation. So in other words, essentially the question is asking how much economic regulation should the American government impose on the economy, and what should that look like at the federal level and at the state level, which is what we've been discussing. So I'm going to do just a brief overview of American economic history. And I say brief, it may feel rather in depth to you, but keep in mind that whole college courses are designed to discuss this topic. You can spend 16 weeks talking about American economic history and go extremely in depth with it. So this is only going to cover through the Great Depression. We just don't have a lot of time for some of the other topics. But I encourage you to look into it more and really understand what the Constitution says about economic regulation and what that looks like. So as you complete your discussion for next week, and I'm going ahead and posting this now since my lectures are on Thursdays and you guys are, your discussion is due on Wednesday. I think this will be helpful for you. But go ahead and kind of make sure you read through the study materials that are provided. You've got a document from John Dewey, and you also have FDR's Commonwealth Club address. So make sure that as you answer next week's discussion that you reference those documents, you've read them thoroughly, and you synthesize that with the content that we're going to go through today. So I'm going to get started here. Let me just open us with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we just thank you for our day. I thank you for our class. Pray that you would be with us in all that we do, that everyone would be well prepared for the discussion, and that you just lead and guide me on what I say and help me to explain things in a way that it's easy to understand. We pray this in Jesus' name. Okay, so we're looking at exploration to Confederation. And we've talked a lot about the American Revolution. The American colonies were part of Britain's empire, as you know. And so the taxation was one of the instigators of the American Revolution. And we talked several times about what actually sparked the flames of the American Revolution. Was it an economically based war? Was it a religiously based war? Other factors at play as well. And so because taxation was sort of the driving factor behind action, you could call the American Revolution a war of economics, right? You had the Boston Tea Party, which occurred because of frustrations over London's control of the tea trade. And after the war was over, you had this Revolutionary War debt. Now, remember that under the Articles of Confederation, the states only had the right to tax. The federal government couldn't tax. And so the states were sort of tasked with helping to pay back some of this debt. And they had their own things going on. They really weren't very helpful to the federal government. So a lot of historical scholars will say that the Constitution was written because of economic problems. And that was one major reason. There were obviously, we've talked about this many times, other major reasons as well. But economics was a driving factor, one of the driving factors in the creation of the American Constitution. You had continental currency. So the colonies had inflation, right? And so this goes all the way back before, we're talking like 1780s, right? The war ended in 1783. And so you have these monetary policies, and at the time, they're just forming American government. They didn't really know what it was going to look like. They had an idea of what they wanted it to look like, but it took them a while to flesh out a program that was actually going to be appropriate for all the various needs, including financials. So the states were unable to help the federal government with its monetary crisis. You had Shays' Rebellion, remember talking about that? And so that sort of led to the need for the Constitutional Convention. So in terms of economics, what did the founders think, right? That's kind of our go-to question on all the issues that we've been discussing. Well, how would the founders have answered that? So the Constitution contains only two sections dealing with monetary issues. Section 8 permits Congress to coin money and to regulate its value, which obviously is important because if each state coined its own money, Imagine if you had to exchange currency every time you cross state lines. That would be rather annoying, right? And so we are very thankful that we have one US dollar across all 50 states, right? And so the Section 10 denies states the right to coin or to print their own money. Now, further, the federal government also has the ability to lay and collect taxes in order to pay debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Again, that's a very broad term, right? The Constitution was meant to be broad so that it would be long lasting. What pay debts and what should that look like? General welfare, what should that look like? Making FDR's New Deal quite possible, right? Because it's general welfare. There have been suggestions that we should pass a constitutional amendment that places a limit to how much the United States government can borrow. And not necessarily a dollar amount, but almost like the GDP. If you take the GDP to debt ratio. So the debt cannot exceed a certain percentage of the GDP, which means it would fluctuate. And obviously, we're beyond that right now. We would have, if we were going to pass an amendment like that, we'd have to come up with a plan to get the debt paid down, and then it would be unconstitutional to borrow beyond that point again. Well, what sort of problems would that cause in American economy if we were to pass an amendment like that? What if there were things that we really need and, per the Constitution, we couldn't borrow? That might be an issue as well. But that's one it's in common sense economics. They suggest the debt to GDP ratio as a solution. So, yes, we have constitutionally, we have the right to borrow money. The federal government has the right to borrow money. Doesn't say how much. And it empowers Congress to limit foreign trade as necessary to defend the interests of the United States against exclusionary trade policies. Now, you can imagine after the American Revolution was over, Great Britain didn't really want to trade with us, right? And which is a natural consequence from all of that. And of course, those things have changed now, but those were the things that they were thinking about at the time that it was written. And so they also have the right to establish uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcies. Now, this was a big deal. I live in the state of Georgia. Georgia was originally created as a colony to be a debtor's haven. Now, that didn't really work out. I think I went into that with you guys. Only about a third of the original population of Georgia were actually debtors released from prison. And, they established that headright system, and it changed things and really encouraged slavery and didn't really work out the way that they thought it was going to. But Madison argued that imprisonment for debt was one of the great plagues of the time. And so, the idea that you would go to jail for a debt seemed an infringement on liberty to some of the founders. And so they created bankruptcy court and things like that. So they have the right to coin money. The federal government does to regulate the value of that money and of foreign coin. They can fix the standard of weights and measures. The framers clearly intended a national monetary system based on coin and for the power to regulate that system to rest only with the federal government. So paper money didn't come along until a little bit later. And you look at like Lincoln, the greenbacks, and I'm going to get into that as we go through this PowerPoint. So they also had the ability to provide for punishment of counterfeiting. And of course, if you go to the Federal Reserve Bank, they have a nice little counterfeiting museum. It's kind of fun to see. The one here in Atlanta does. I haven't been to all of them, but I would imagine most of the Federal Reserve banks have some sort of display where you can look at counterfeit money and kind of study it against the real thing. And it's very interesting. So Hamilton, I believe I posted, there's a video from Mark Summerlin. He works with Johns Hopkins University, and he does an economic history lecture. So he states in that lecture that Hamilton is responsible for an intricate financial system that we have. And he basically created a bank out of thin air. Hamilton wanted to demonstrate that we could honor our obligations. So again, we're coming out of the American Revolution. We've got all this debt. The states aren't paying. We got Shays' Rebellion. Things are kind of falling apart economically. What do we do? Well, he wanted to encourage the purchase of bonds, right? And so he opened a bank and he offered 10 million shares for purchase. Now he sold the first 2 million shares to the federal government. So, but they basically had to borrow from nothing to be able to buy those shares. But it sort of made us look good to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world started investing in America. And so he then sold the remaining 8 million shares to international investors who paid him in gold and silver. That created a bank with actual money in it, and off we go. That actually, believe it or not, is not so different from what Donald Trump did. When, if you've ever watched, there's some documentaries on him when he was building the Taj Mahal in Vegas. He ran out of money and couldn't pay his workers, all the builders, and so he created Trump stock, and people started investing in Trump stock. He took that money, he paid for the rest of the Taj Mahal to be built, and then he and his investors got quite a bit of wealth. Now, that is sort of an underboard dealing, right? These are not really tactics that you would use in today's society, but back historically, they worked, especially at the founding. And so you fast forward to the 1800s, and the US economy went through alternating periods of growth and recession. So this is that my NCEAT students have to do an analysis of this sort of heart monitor of our debt here. And so in 1790, you can see the American Revolution debt. It went down considerably. And Andrew Jackson, one of our presidents, was the only president to ever fully pay off the national debt. So we kind of tip our hats to him for that. However, he did it in sort of an underboard way, which I'm going to talk about. And Jackson is also known for the Trail of Tears, for Indian removal, for slavery, for some really negative things. And there are a lot of historians who don't like Jackson at all. But I suppose this is one of his better moments, although it did kind of tank the US economy in some ways too, which was not good. But then you have the Civil War. You can see that our debt rose again. When there's a war, typically the debt surges, right? And then it kind of decreases, goes down. And then you've got World War I. You've got the Great Depression here, and then World War II. And again, these are sort of like FDR's New Deal programs. He's embracing some Keynesian economic theory here, which basically says that you can borrow in times of trouble, which is what he did. And then you've got the Reagan era. And Reagan had this program called Reaganomics. And so that went somewhat well. And then you have the Great Recession. The graph kind of ends around 2011 when you have that housing market crisis. So, but you can kind of pause on this and look through it and kind of, if you know your history and what's happened, you can kind of piece things together about how this went. So Jackson was elected in 1828. He was known as an advocate for the common man and an enemy of power and privilege. So he had some really positive traits, but he opposed the Bank of the United States. He wanted hard currency that was based on gold and silver. Now, historically, and especially you'll see when we get into the Great Depression, when the money is based on gold and silver, it actually creates more problems than it solves in a lot of cases. And that was, it has stabilizing effects of the economy, but then it also can, it just creates hindrances as well. So Jackson was correct in his criticism of the bank for using its power to wield political influence. Naturally, that's kind of one of the things that's a byproduct of it. And so Jackson paid off the national debt completely in 1835. The National Bank's charter was up for renewal in 1836. He refused to renew it, and Congress couldn't override his veto. And so after re-election, he removed federal funds from the bank. Now imagine, okay, so you've got this issue here of like state banks versus the federal bank, right? And what's going on? Like, where should the bank actually be housed? And I guess if there's a flaw in the Constitution, it doesn't really say, right? And maybe that's something they should have put in there. Should we have a federal bank, or should the banks only be in control by the states? And then the federal government, but if the federal government can tax, and this is the argument very early on, if the federal government can tax and they have money, then they have to have a place to put that money. So naturally, they would have to have a bank, right? And so the argument goes round and round because the Constitution just doesn't say. And so federal officials tried to fight back by depositing money in state banks. The director of the second Bank of the United States wanted to show the value of a national bank, and so he limited loans and demanded non-payment for state-issued notes. Now, the influx of funds in the state banks led to more printing of money and more loans. And then the national bank kind of became even more irrelevant because if everyone is doing business with the state banks, why do you need the national bank to begin with? And so then you have the state versus federal issue again. So this at the same time that the state banks were thriving, the federal government also had a surplus. So they not only had tax revenues, but they had sold some lands in the West. And so in 1836, Congress passed a law that distributed surplus funds directly to those state governments. Now, about a month later, the Jackson administration changed federal policy and ordered that buyers make payments for land sales on hard money, only in hard money. And so this weakened the state banks in two ways. So, first, the federal government withdrew funds from state banks, and thus state banks could not use those funds as assets. And second, specie reserves, which is basically the amount of cash that a bank has kept on hand, diminished because the federal requirement for hard money on land purchases. So, you can kind of see where this is going. By 1837, the country was headed for a panic. About one third of American workers were without jobs, and that was at a rate that wasn't even seen during the Great Depression. And so the economy finally recovered around 1843, thanks in part to natural resources and developing technologies. Now, the Civil War had a major impact, as we saw on the graph, right? Maybe not as big of an impact as some of the situations, but it was pretty large. And so the South was typically wealthier than the North up to that point in the nation's history. The North financed the war by printing greenbacks as currency through, and they also had bonds. The Confederacy printed currency, but obviously it's kind of like if you've ever seen Gone with the Wind. After the war is over, Scarlett's talking to her dad, and he pulls out these Confederate bonds, and she says, "Oh, they're worthless," and it's because the war is over. There is no Confederacy. It's not a government. Therefore, the money means nothing. And so that's kind of what happened with all that. Now, paper money tends to cause inflation, but it also enables economic growth. And so this is the thing when you have gold supporting your dollar, right? Like let's just say you have, I don't know, and this is not true, but like if you had a fraction of like a quarter of a gold bar for every dollar, then you have this equal uh, value to it, right? But if you print more money, what happens to it? Well, all of a sudden you don't have 1/4 of the gold bar backing the dollar, you have 1/8 or 1/10 or whatever it may be. Because the more money that you put into circulation, the more inflation you're going to have because it devalues the currency. Now, that can be good in terms of debt. If you have a lot of debt and there's inflation, guess what happens to your debt? Well, if the value of the money is less, so is your debt because your debt is measured in dollars or whatever the currency of the country is, right? And so it's like paying back less during the time. So it could be good to inflate the economy because then you can repay your debts at a lower rate and maybe then deflate it later. So that's a basic economic principle as well. So after the Civil War, the government began withdrawing the greenbacks from circulation. Farmers and debtors opposed the move, and the Treasury Department stopped withdrawing them in 1868. So in 1873, the government went to a gold only standard. However, the minting of silver coins began in 1878, and silver dollars became common. So in 1895, J.P. Morgan worked with the government to protect and increase gold reserves. Now, that the Federal Reserve Bank didn't exist all of this time that we have just discussed. They didn't exist until 1913. And so it was really sometime around 1907 that you had a series of financial panics caused by the American businessmen, and they wanted to create a better system to regulate currency and banking prices. So they met on Jekyll Island in 1910 to figure out how to put a system together. Um, so the men were Nelson Aldrich, A. Piatt Andrew, Henry Davidson, Arthur Shelton, Frank Vanderlip, and Paul Warburg. They all met at a club. And I love Jekyll Island. I have to say, I live in Georgia, so it's my favorite island to go visit at the beach. We actually went down last summer for my husband's birthday. It's beautiful. You cannot take a bad photo on Driftwood Beach. And there are so many historical buildings. It's a fun place to go biking. It's just a great, great fun vacation if you've never been there. So, but that's kind of how the Federal Reserve came into being. Now, the men drafted a plan that divided the nation into 12 banking districts, and each district is served by a private regional Federal Reserve Bank. Now, over the district banks, there would be a central government run organization called the Federal Reserve Board, and each region reflects the economy in the area that's located. So you can kind of see the Federal Reserve, it's almost like the courts, right? Like we have the district courts and regional courts, and so you also have these Federal Reserve regions as well. And so it's set up kind of like this. I pulled this from Investopedia just to make it easy for you. The Federal Reserve System has one central bank. They have three key entities, the Board of Governors, the 12 banks, and then the Open Market Committee. And then there's five key functions within all that. They need to conduct the nation's monetary policy. They help maintain the stability of the financial system. They supervise and regulate financial institutions, foster payment and settlement systems safely and efficiently, and they promote consumer protection and community development. So very instrumental to American economy today. Now, the Board of Governors oversees the Federal Reserve System. The members of this board are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. They serve a 14-year term and they can create and regulate monetary policy. So you may have seen how they decide interest rates. Each bank has a 9-member board of directors. 3 of these directors are appointed by the board in Washington, and the other 6 are elected by member banks in the district, and they work outside of banking. So the chair of the board is one of the 3 appointed directors, and this is a little bit older. I put this is probably 2 or 3, gosh, maybe even 4 years ago. So I'd have to go back and double check to make sure these are updated names, but you guys can kind of check into that and see what you find. And so ultimately, the Federal Reserve Bank, and this is where it's at, okay? So really pay attention to this slide. They represent a compromise between a totally private banking system and a totally government-controlled banking system. The Federal Reserve does not receive funding through the congressional budgetary process. The Fed's income comes primarily from the interest on government securities that it acquired through open market operations. And so one of the things that came up, okay, this is how they started. The federal government was borrowing, and they were borrowing a lot of money from the states, and specifically during the Gilded Age. Okay, so you have these men like Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Carnegie, all of the Gilded Age moguls. And so the federal government was borrowing money from them, and they'd come back and pay it back, and then have to borrow again and things like that. And they wanted to create a more formal system that was a little bit more dignified. And so that's sort of the reason the Federal Reserve Bank was created, just to kind of keep the U.S. government afloat in times of need, and just to create, like I said, a more dignified system. And so one of the main purposes of the Federal Reserve is to act as a lender of last resort, allowing banks to borrow from the central bank when needed. In 1913, when the Fed was created, it loaned money to commercial banks when risky business prospects made the commercial banks nervous. Today, the Fed increases the supply of money to spur growth, and it shrinks to curb inflation. So I encourage you to kind of watch the decisions that they're making, and determine for yourself, like, do you think these are good decisions? Is it good to increase interest rates at this time? Is it what are going to be the implications of this, and why are they making certain decisions? Which really lends itself more to like economic theory. We're talking about political theory here, right? And more how and why they exist, not really the nitty gritty of the everyday decisions, but that's important as well. And so they do this. They manipulate reserve requirements. They change the discount rate. They open market operations. The reserve ratio allows banks to have less cash on hand, and then they can loan out more money. And so this increases the money supply that's in circulation. Now, I don't know if you've ever toured a Federal Reserve Bank. One of the things that I thought was really interesting, I've toured it several times I've taken field trips, like organized field trips for groups of students to go up there. I did one a few years ago, and they were saying that they know it almost to the dollar how much money is in circulation. So like the Brinks armored cars that you might see outside the grocery store and things like that, they are actually counting how many ones, fives, tens, 20s, all of the coins. They're going through and counting all of that. And so she said it might be off by a percentage, but she said you would be surprised at how accurately they know exactly how much money is in circulation at this time, which kind of blew my mind a little bit. But open market conditions refer to the Fed's buying and selling of government securities, and it can increase and decrease the money supply by doing that. And so Ben Bernanke was the 14th chair of the Federal Reserve Bank. And so we're going to kind of shift gears now because we're talking about 1913, right, that the Fed was created. Well, you get into 1929 and you've got the Great Depression, right? And so this is going to be the last section of this PowerPoint. But Ben Bernanke said that to understand the Great Depression is the holy grail of macroeconomics. And so what does that mean, right? It's just that there are so many theories as to what actually caused the Great Depression. And so you probably want to start by looking at the Gilded Age. Honestly, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you have Andrew Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, all the men who I was telling you about. They had these monopolies on certain industries, which is where the game monopoly comes from in the first place. And the system allowed this type of wealth to thrive. It created an atmosphere that was easy to take advantage of, and you have a number of unintended consequences. So the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was put in place by Theodore Roosevelt and his administration, that was intended to stop the monopolies from happening so that everyone could have a slice of the pie in the capitalist game, right? And so in terms of the Great Depression, you have professor of economics at Rutgers University, Eugene White. He states that most of the usual factors that are attributed to the economic collapse of 1929, the Great Depression, are only minor contributions. He says that the cause was actually a progression of events that began with regulations on commercial banks. National banks were prohibited from lending more than 10% of their capital and surplus to one customer. And because of this, commercial banks purchased bonds, but they couldn't legally trade or acquire equities. And so, because of this, they set up security affiliates who eventually became big distributors of stocks and bonds. Then they became underwriters. And by 1930, commercial bank affiliates had obtained roughly half of the bond obligations. Between 1928 and 29, stock prices were valued at much higher than they were actually worth. People were also buying stock on credit, I might add, and dividends were rising, but not enough to keep up with the stock values. Typically, dividends don't rise, or dividends do not rise unless the rise in earnings is considered permanent. So you had sort of all these problems at play, right? And so both Congress and the Federal Reserve recognized the problem, and there were a lot of policy blunders that happened. So, is it possible that maybe the Federal Reserve was very young? They didn't understand the power they were wielding over the American economy, and they made some pretty bad decisions. And so, now we're far down the road from that. We understand these things better. So, you could say that it was a conglomerate of all of these issues combined into one. I'll let you guys kind of read through this on your own, but you can kind of get the idea of what's going on here. Now, one very interesting argument is that the country, so the Great Depression happened here in the United States, but the consequences of it reverberated around the world. And it sort of led in some ways to World War II because, Germany was already paying a lot of reparations. They were blamed for World War I through the War Guilt Clause that's in the Treaty of Versailles, and there's a whole lot to all of that. But because our economy tanked, so did economies overseas, and so governments across the world were trying to figure out what to do. And the ones that abandoned the gold standard early on recovered from the Great Depression a lot sooner than the ones who didn't. So you have the gold standard was suspended at the beginning of World War I. UK returned to it in 1925. France did the same thing in 28. And by 29, nearly all the nations had followed suit. They all wanted a standard for their currency. By 1933, a number of nations had again abandoned it. And those that did actually came out better in the end. And so, today I think I've talked about this that we're actually our currency is fiat money, which means it's based on our promise to pay. So we've abandoned all standards at this point, and we're living on our good credit. So, but I hope this was helpful. Really think about where in terms of monetary policy, who should be regulating it? What does as you answer the night watchman approach question, what sort of economic regulation is best for the economy? That's what that question is essentially asking. And again, remember to review the reading and study materials, the Commonwealth Club address, the document from John Dewey, and make sure you reference those in your post next week. So I think that about covers it. I appreciate you guys taking the time to tune in, and I hope that you have a wonderful week.